and I just want to welcome everybody to this session and of the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. We're in mile 5, and up next is Nick Charlebois. No, I probably didn't pronounce it right there, but anyway, that's my French for. And Nick's going to talk to us about M365DSC, which is pretty exciting for me. I'm a PowerShell guy, so hopefully this will be of interest to me. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Matt. All right. So first off, you've probably seen this slide already, but the Microsoft or the SharePoint conference is being rebranded to Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. And the next event is going to be in March next year, so 2021, hopefully in person by then. First off, let me just quickly thank all the sponsors. I mean, because of them, we're able to make this event happen and reach so many of you folks at home. I'm Nick Charlebois. I'm a senior Premier Field engineer at Microsoft. Been working with Microsoft for 4 years now. I used to be a PowerShell MVP before joining Microsoft back in 2015. I'm based out of Gatineau, Quebec. Most of the stuff we're going to be talking about today, you can find blog articles on my blog, right? Most of my articles are around Azure DevOps, being able to automate stuff with PowerShell, do some PowerShell desired state configuration. So most of the stuff we're going to be talking about today, you can find a blog article on my blog about it. I'm the product lead for a couple of products, but most importantly, the Microsoft 365 DSC tool, which is the focus of this session today. One thing I'd like to point out is that there's going to be a raffle at the end of the event. You need to visit the vendor's booth and answer questions. You need 5 correct answers to be eligible for the draw. So make sure you visit the sponsor's booth. So let's get started. So what is Microsoft 365 DSC? And the DSC in the name there stands for Desired State Configuration. That is something that's been around since 2014. That was released with PowerShell 4. And that is a way of automating your configuration and making sure it stays in that desired configuration if you want. So the tool that we're presenting today sits on top of PowerShell DSC, and it allows you to go and configure your environments, your Microsoft 365 environments, pretty much all the workloads that you'll find in Microsoft 365. We'll cover exactly what workloads are supported in the later slides, but that's it in a nutshell. So really the focus of the tool is around 6 main pillars. The first one is the automation. This idea of being able to write your configuration and deploy it, right? So you write a definition of what your configuration should be, and you simply run it, and it will bring that environment in the desired state. The second one is the ability to export or extract full fidelity configuration from existing environments. So instead of having you write your configuration from scratch, you can use the tool, point it at one of your existing Microsoft 365 tenants, and extract the configuration out of it. It will extract it as a PowerShell file that is a DSC configuration. Because you can do the automation and you can do the export, well, you can synchronize multiple tenants. You can extract the configuration from one tenant and use that extract to replicate the configuration across multiple tenants. We're going to do a demo of that as well. The fourth thing is the ability to do assessment. So to be able to assess against what we call blueprints, which are best practices, to assess your configuration against it, to be able to compare 2 tenants, see where the configuration differs, to be able to do point-in-time comparison, right? So basically being able to generate delta reports of your configuration. The fifth thing is the ability to do monitoring. Because the tool is built on Microsoft or PowerShell desired state configuration, on a regular basis, it's going to do what we call consistency check and make sure that the environment is still in that desired state, right? So if it detects any configuration drift, right, that something changed that's not matching what the desired configuration should have been, it can act on it. Again, we're going to talk about this in more detail in the next few slides. And then the last one is the ability to generate reports out of your configuration. It's good to be able to export that configuration as a PS1 file, but not everybody's familiar with PowerShell. So you want to be able to generate those eye-candy report out of your configurations that you can distribute to your users and for them to be able to get a better sense as to what their current configuration looks like. So that's it in a nutshell. The tool right now is 100% open source. It's on GitHub. So you can go github.com/Microsoft/Microsoft365DSC. All the documentation is on the official website. You can find the link at the bottom of this slide. It's Microsoft365DSC.com. That's what it resolves to. We do have a team of dedicated engineers across the world. So the tool, even though it's community driven, it's led by Microsoft engineers and consultants. So we do have folks in pretty much every time zone. We're always looking for help, for people to test out new features that we're about to release, for people to contribute to the project. Honestly, the only thing you need is to understand PowerShell to contribute back, right? To be able to write some resources. Right now, for example, we have folks in the community helping out with some of the Exchange journal rule stuff, right? So you can feel free. We have our backlog on the GitHub repo. You can go take a look at the backlog of items that are up for grabs. If you're interested in helping out, just ping us on GitHub directly, and we'll make sure we set up a call with you and help you get started. And then any suggestions or ideas, please use either the issue tab in the GitHub repo, or we have an official user voice site as well that's available under the community user voice for Microsoft 365. So you can find us there. Let's talk about the first pillar. The first pillar, as I mentioned, is the ability to automate your configuration. So PowerShell desired state configuration, for those of you that are not familiar with what it is, it's a way to represent your configuration in a declarative fashion. And so it's basically telling what you want the system to be configured like. So you write almost a story, you write the definition. In this case here, what I'm defining is I want to create a new SharePoint Online site, so an SPO site, that has the title, My SPO Site, that has the following URL. The owner is going to be admin at Contoso. So you define what the properties are, and then you just run that, and then we'll bring the environment in that desired state. If we put that in comparison with the traditional approach, which we call the imperative approach, right, which we're all familiar with, the imperative approach is really about how can you get to that state, right? It mentions what actions to take. So in this case here, it's creating a new site, so new SPO site. If you run that imperative command once, it will go and create the website or the site collection. If you run it twice, it will error out. It will say it already exists. Right? So if you want to go and modify some settings about your site, you then need to call into the set SPO site command instead. Whereas with DSC, it really doesn't matter. Let's say in there in that block where I have my definition for my SPO site, I added property about quotas. Right? So I want to set what the quotas should be. If I want to modify the quota of an existing site, all I need to do is update that value in that definition and rerun the script. DSC by default will use idempotency, so you can run it as often as you want. You're always going to end up in that desired state. It's very important. Now, as I mentioned, the idea behind Microsoft 365 DSC is that you can write your configurations code. You write that configuration, and then by executing that configuration, it will go and configure all the workloads that you have in Microsoft 365. The workloads that we currently support are security and compliance, SharePoint Online, OneDrive. We have Power Platform, we have Azure AD, Exchange Online, Teams, some Office 365 stuff, so licenses, users, and so on. And we have a team in Japan dedicated to creating the Intune resources. All right, so that's coming as well. We have plans to start working on Planner resources as well in the next couple of weeks. So it's still expanding, like the scope of the tool is still growing, but those are the workloads that we currently support that you can start using the tool to manage. So how does it work? Under the cover, right now, let's say your title is Microsoft 365 Administrator, whatever that means. Right, that means a lot of things, but you need to go and be able to manage all the workloads that are available in Microsoft 365. Well, for Azure AD, you need to go and acquire the Azure AD PowerShell module, or use the graph. For SharePoint, you need the SharePoint PnP module or the SharePoint Online Management Shell. For Teams, you need the Microsoft Teams PowerShell module that will let you interact with Teams channels and users. But for everything that has to do with policies and for voice commands, you need the Skype for Business API. Exchange Online, you need the Exchange Online Management Shell. So you get the picture, right? There's many moving pieces that you need to install before you can start managing your entire workload. With Microsoft 365 DSC, we're really providing you with an abstraction layer. When you install the module, you go install module Microsoft 365 DSC, it will go and download all the dependencies under the cover. So all those modules that are required by default, they'll get installed. And Microsoft 365 DSC, when you write your configuration, it will know where to go and call, right? So if those modules ever change, or if we decide, for example, because one thing we have on the roadmap is to drop the support from some of those dependencies and start using the graph more, right? It doesn't change your configuration. All you need to do is write your configuration. You don't really have to care what's being called under the cover, right? That's part of the logic of Microsoft 365 DSC. So it's one configuration to rule them all, pretty much. You can write in the same configuration. You can have DLP policies for security and compliance. You can have Teams calling policies, SharePoint Online Site, all within one configuration, and that will go and automatically get deployed. One thing that's really important, the tool is focusing on configuration and structure, right? By structure, I mean things like teams, channels, and users. To me, those are not really configuration. Those are mostly structure. Site collections fall in that bucket as well. We're not doing data, right? The reason for this is that we want to make sure that the tool is there to manage configuration that you would normally control through the admin panel, right? We're not dealing with like SharePoint lists and so on. It could be extended to manage that, but it's not the focus of the tool. Some of the stuff we're planning around Planner will fall in that gray zone where we're actually going to be doing some data configuration there, but that's not the main focus. Also, the tool doesn't support PowerShell core. The reason for this is that the dependencies don't support it, right? So for example, PNP, which we're using to interact with SharePoint Online, doesn't support PowerShell core yet. So there's no point in us trying to update the abstraction layer if the dependencies don't support it. We're in touch with the product group. We're trying to align with their vision. We're trying to move some of the stuff over to the Graph API, as I mentioned earlier. So once we have that done, we're going to be able to leverage PowerShell core for Microsoft 365 DSC as well. But right now, it's PowerShell desktop only. Recommended version is 5.1. We support PowerShell 4. But if you can do 5.1, it would probably be a better overall experience. So let's jump into a demo. So the first demo I want to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to define one configuration that defines three things. It defines a sensitivity label for security and compliance. It defines the SharePoint Online sharing settings. So things like, all right, here's what the default sharing link type should be. So it's set to internal. Do we for example, here, right? Wow, that's a mouthful. So require accepting account match invite account, right? Set to true. So you define all the properties that are available for that sharing settings. We have a Teams calling policy in here that defines that you're not allowed to call groups. We allow delegation. We disable private calling and so on. So I'm just writing a definition as to what I want to apply to my environment. Now this configuration here, I'm going to go and apply against my source tenant. Okay. Throughout all the demos, I'm always going to be using two tenants. The first one is the source, which is represented by the user S at the top right corner, and the other one is my target tenant. Those are two separate tenants, right? What we see here is that in my source tenant, I'm just going to refresh this to show you that there's no smoke and mirrors, but we don't have, we only have three calling policies, which are the default ones, right? Should come back anytime. So we only have three. Based on my definition here, I'm trying to add a fourth one called automate demo policy. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to run this here. It's going to prompt me for my credentials. I'm going to pass in the credentials for my source tenant and let it run. Now, the question I'm sure all of you have is, what was that account, right? The account you're passing in when you're trying to configure something needs to have admin rights to the workload you're trying to configure. In my case here, I'm trying to configure security and compliance, SharePoint Online, and Teams, right? So because they're all part of the same configuration, the account I'm using needs to have access to those three workloads, right? You can break down the configuration. If you only have access, you only want the Teams admin to be able to manage team stuff, they can break down the configuration and keep all the Teams component in their own configuration so that when they run the configuration, they provide their Teams admin credentials. In my case, because I'm lazy, what I did is I just used the global admin account, but you don't have to. When we deal with the export feature, you're going to see that just read access on the workload is good. Like global reader, for example, will allow you to go and extract everything. But to deploy or configure something, you need to have admin access to those workloads. So let's going in right now, it's creating the policies. So one question in the chat is about modern auth. Right? Modern auth is challenging. It's working for the export, right? So for the export, you can go and you can do an extract using an account that's MFA enabled. So you run the export, it's going to prompt you for the MFA challenge, you do it, and off it goes. The challenge comes when you're trying to automate something. We'll talk about it later when we deal with the monitoring piece, but the thing is that under the cover, DSC every 15 minutes will trigger the configuration. So what happened there? Yeah, okay. But every time you go and you run the configuration, right, every 15 minutes, it will go and try to check to make sure that the environment is still in that desired state, and it will prompt the MFA challenge. So imagine that your day is done, you're deploying your configuration, you go home, and in the car 15 minutes later, you get the MFA challenge again because DSC is still running, right? So that is a challenge. What we're doing is that we're currently trying, well, some resources support using service principles. Some stuff in Teams, some stuff in SharePoint, some in Azure AD, they do. The challenge is that the resources in Exchange Online, for example, the Exchange Online management shell, the new version of the module, doesn't yet support service principle. They are working on it. It's coming anytime within the next few weeks. Once that's available, we're going to be able to authenticate with service principle. So that will get around the MFA challenge you have where it keeps prompting you, right? But right now, it is still a challenge. So for the export, no problem with MFA. Configuring it can be a bit of a pain. Okay, so let's just go back here. So if I refresh this here. So we can see that my demo policy got created. Okay. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is he trying to reinvent the wheel here, right? We already have PowerShell modules that work. Like, why is DSC such a big deal if we already have all those modules? Well, the reason for this is that DSC is not only good at bringing an environment in the desired state, it's also good at keeping the environment in that desired state. So remember, I was just telling you a few minutes ago that every 15 minutes, there's going to be a job that runs with DSC. That's what we call the consistency check. Out of the box with PowerShell DSC, when you run configuration, every 15 minutes, there's going to be a consistency check that's going to be done to make sure that the environment is still in that desired state. That is basically the DSC engine asking the question, are you still configured as you should? Okay. So it's going to go in, it's going to run this consistency check, do an analysis to see if there's any drift. And if it detects a configuration drift, it can act on it. So it can do three things. It can automatically fix any drift it detected. It can log the issue in Event Viewer, or it can alert the admins. If they're using something like Azure DevOps Pipeline, you can actually send an email to the admin saying, look, there was a drift that was detected at 11:05 this morning where the data loss prevention policy was disabled, right? And then you can take action on it. The ability to fix comes out of the box with PowerShell DSC. We're going to talk about the various modes that we have, but basically with DSC out of the box, you can configure your machine to do three things. The first one is apply only, which is basically you give it a configuration, you go, here's how I want to be configured. Just bring me in that desired state. And once you're done, your job is done, right? And then you give the key to the users, and that snowflake effect starts happening because they'll start changing the configuration. That's the first option. The second option, which is the default one, it's called apply and monitor. So that one will do the 15 minutes consistency check. If it detects that there's a drift, it will log it in Event Viewer. So that's the default mode. And then the third mode, which is extremely powerful, but also extremely dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, is the apply and autocorrect. Okay, so that one will automatically detect a drift and fix it. Reason why I'm saying it's extremely dangerous is, remember at the beginning I was telling you that the tool deals with configuration and structure. Imagine the scenario where you have your users deploying all of their teams structures, so their teams, their channels, their users using DSC. And they configure DSC to be apply and autocorrect. So they go in to deploy 1,000 teams and 5,000 channels. The owner of those channels are allowed to go and rename those channels if they want to, or to delete them. That's part of the tool, right? It's almost considered data at that point. So let's say team owner decides to do some spring cleaning, and they go and they delete five channels that were never used. Well, if you're set and applying autocorrect within 15 minutes, those channels are all going to come back, right? So that's why I'm saying you need to be very careful about what you do. The beauty about the tool, the Microsoft 365 DSC tool, compared to other DSC module, is that we allow you to break down your configuration and pick and choose what will be assigned to what mode. For example, I can say, I'm going to be bringing, let's say, I break down the configuration in SharePoint Online. Everything that's SharePoint Online, site collection, user properties, property bag, and so on. I just want to be notified if a configuration drift is detected. I don't want you to fix it, right? Because I want to allow some configuration drift to happen, but just let me be in control and notify me about it. However, everything that's security and compliance, that is mission critical. If something changes in there and you detect a drift, fix it right away. And notify me also, but fix it, right? So that is one option that you have to break down the configuration. Going back to the chat window, so the 15 minutes analysis drift is configurable. Yes, 15 minutes is the default, it's the minimum value, right? So you can't have it run every minute because it takes time to do the analysis, right? So 15 is the minimum, 30 days is the maximum. So you can have it done monthly as well if you want. Totally configurable. One thing you can do is if you want to go and update or to speed up the consistency check, you can break down again the configuration on multiple hosts, and you can say, all right, so you're responsible for SharePoint to do the consistency checks here. You're responsible for Exchange, so you can actually scale out, right? So then the other one is, do you advise to install the Microsoft 365 DSC dev branch? That is the branch that's on GitHub, right? So everything that's merged there is stable. What we do is on GitHub every 6 weeks, we run through a set of additional tests, and then we publish the PowerShell gallery. So the dev branch normally contains the latest features, right? So think of it as the preview, and then what's on the PowerShell gallery is the release, the official release. I would say it's safe to install the dev branch. That's probably the one you want to go and install. Okay, so let's just move on. I'll answer some other questions later on. Now, configuration drift, let me go back to my source tenant. So this is the tenant we just configured. I'm going to go in and I'm going to delete that automate demo policy. So we all agree that I've just created a configuration drift here. Under the cover, what's going to happen is that the tool every 15 minutes is going to be running something called test DSC configuration. Now, I'm not a patient guy. I'm not going to wait 15 minutes for that to happen, right? So I'm forcing it to do it. So I'm basically telling the tool, please go ahead and force the check that's happening under the cover. And what it's going to come back with is going to tell me, all right, first off, are you in the desired state? And if you're not, what components are not in the desired state? So in our case, it should come back with false, saying, no, you're not. And here's why, because your allow calling or automate demo policy is not in the desired state. It was deleted. So this is what's happening under the cover every 15 minutes in my case, right? But it's totally configurable. So we're going to let it run a bit. So one question we have is, where's the DSC workload running? So that's a pretty good question. Right now in my demos, it's running on my local machine. However, the moment I close the lid on that laptop, that consistency check is gone. So recommendation is you can either use Azure Automation, yes, but Azure Automation is a weird scenario because you need a VM, right? So you need to assign a VM to Azure Automation, so that configuration will get run on that VM, and that VM will just talk back to Microsoft 365. So it's almost as if this VM is a middleman now, right? So you have a VM just to do the consistency check. The preferred approach is to run that in Azure DevOps pipeline. And that is an extremely good segue to my next demo, which is imagine the scenario here, right? So you're an admin and you've broke down your entire tenant configuration in 3 configurations. So you have one for Exchange, one for SharePoint, and one for Teams. Okay? This configuration is stored in source control, GitHub, or Azure DevOps, right? And it's now become your source of truth. So any configuration change you want to do to your environment, you need to make it in code. Don't go on the graphical user interface and start making changes. There are some changes to code. Everything has to be done within the code that you're written. So in this case here, let's imagine that I want to go and create a new Teams calling policy on my environment, and I'm going to call it English because I just did the French session before this one here. So I'm creating a new policy and I'm saying I'm going to allow private calling. So I'm saving this. This file here is stored on Azure DevOps. So I'm just going to go and commit that to my Azure DevOps. commit the file, store that. I'm just going to sync it up. And then on my Azure DevOps, what I have is I have different pipelines for every workload. And then I have a pipeline for Teams. It's going to detect that I just made a change to the Teams configuration. It should trigger the Teams pipeline. Let me just make sure I properly synced that. No, I did not. Right. So the moment it detects that there's a change in the Teams workload, it's going to trigger that pipeline. That pipeline is going to be running some tests. In my case, it's going to be pester tests to analyze that the configuration is valid, that everything's good. And once it compiles properly, it passes all the tests. It's going to go and trigger a release pipeline. It's going to go and deploy that directly to my environment. Should be running now. Right, so what you could do is there we go. So you can actually have multi-tiered pipelines as well. So don't look at the red. I broke that demo just before the session. But basically, what you can have is you can have it pushed to a dev environment, and then the dev team gets an email saying your changes are in dev. Do you approve them? Yes, it goes to QA, and then it goes to prod. So recommendation is to ideally, if you can, run that in pipelines, because that's at this point it becomes almost agentless. And what you can have is you can have pipelines that will do those consistency check. You can have scheduled pipelines. I don't know if I have one. I don't have one here, but you can say, all right, so do the consistency check at 6 a.m. and at 6 p.m. and send me an email if you detect any configuration drift. So that would be the recommended way of running the agent, right? If you don't have a VM where you can actually spare your configuration. You can run it in a container as well. So that's another option. But again, if you're running it in a container on your laptop, the moment you shut down, that laptop is gone, right? So maybe you have a VM that will be a container host that can actually have multiple containers, each running different workloads. That would justify having that VM in there for sure. Once we have everything moved on to PowerShell core, it's going to be much easier to run Azure functions or to run that directly in containers in Azure container instances, right? So that's the vision. So going back to the slides, let's talk about the third pillar, which is the export, which is probably one of the biggest pillar that we have. It's this ability to be able to point the tool at any existing environment and extract full fidelity configuration from it. Call the tool, automatically it will export, it will expose a command called export M365DSC configuration. And if you run that, it will provide you with an interface, a graphical user interface, where you can go pick and choose what components you want to extract. All the files that are exported are going to be in PS1 format, so just configuration like I showed you in previous examples. And all you need then is just to provide the credentials to do the export, right? As I mentioned, global reader is enough to be able to export everything. Or if you're just looking at scaling down on permissions, you can just grant read permission on the workload you're trying to export. So let's do a quick demo. I'm just going to launch Windows Terminal here. And I'm going to call into the export M365DSC configuration. So this is the command that I was telling you about that gets installed out of the box. So if you just go and run this, it will launch the graphical user interface. Now we joke internally that this interface looks like it's coming straight out of the 90s. Completely agree with that. It's not pretty, it's useful. It's built with PowerShell, right? So basically what it gives you is all the components that you can pick and choose. You can clearly see that the components on the right are a little lighter than components on the left, for example, right? Some stuff on Azure AD. We currently support things like groups naming policy, group settings, groups life cycle policy, so groups expiration, that's in there. We have teams working on adding support for Azure AD devices, Azure AD applications, so that is growing. Reason why it's so light right now is because the tool up to about 2 months ago was Office 365 DSC and was really focusing on Office 365. We expanded the reach. We rebranded the tool to Microsoft 365 DSC because we want to make sure we capture things in there like Azure Active Directory, like Intune. So we want to make sure we capture everything in Microsoft 365. So from that tool here, what you can do is you can go and say, all right, unselect everything. I just want to grab all the security and compliance components. Or you can say, you know what, I'm only interested in the Teams emergency calling policies and Teams client configuration. Pick and choose what you want, provide credentials, and you start the extraction. So this is the attended version of the extraction. The unattended version is you can actually use the quiet switch. In my case here, what I'm saying is I'm doing an unattended extract of the Teams calling policies and the Teams meeting policies. And I'm going to be storing that under CDSC demo to export. So I'll run this. It will take a few seconds to complete. And then what it will actually do is it will tell me right here, it'll say, all right, so I'm starting the extract of Teams calling policy. Under the cover, the tool knows that Teams calling policy is available through the Skype for Business API. So it's actually going to go and load that API. You're going to see the progress bar anytime now. So it's actually going to ping that API, get the proxy, download all the connectlets for Skype for Business, and it will actually start extracting all the configuration or the instances of calling and meeting policies in my tenant. So exporting and importing configuration. Let me just park that question for when we start talking about synchronization. So that was a question from chat window about what would be a good use case for exporting and importing config. I have plenty of examples to talk about in the next, when we start talking about the next pillar. So you can see it's doing my extraction right now. Normally, if I didn't specify a path, it would ask me where to store it. In my case here, you can see that 11:31, I'm not lying, it's 11:31 a.m. where I am. So that's my export. And then you can see that in there, I have all my Teams calling policies and all my Teams meeting policies. And in there, you can see that I have Teams NIC demo policy 1 and NIC demo policy 2. So those are from my source tenant. Okay. I'm just going to try to speed up a bit. The other thing that we allow folks to do is to generate reports, right? So let me just quickly skip through this. So reports, again, it's a feature that was requested by users. It's the ability to convert any PS1 file into HTML or Excel. To be honest, right, it's only for people that are not feeling comfortable dealing with PS1 when they're trying to analyze what's in the configuration. So by default, what the tool allows you to do is you can run the new M365DSC report from config, specify what type of report you want, HTML or Excel, and you pass in the path of your PS1. So this is the one I just exported, right? So if I run it as HTML, you're going to see that it's going to generate my report.html here. And that is my config, my PowerShell file, but represented as an HTML table. So you can go in, you can send that to the customers if they want. I'll be honest, I call this lipstick on a pig. It's just converting PowerShell file into an Excel or HTML table. Some users like it, it's there, it's available. The other option is the ability to do the same thing, but in Excel. Of course, it requires Excel to be installed on the machine. What we'll do is it will launch Excel. It will do something very, very similar. Those cells that you see highlighted, those are the primary key for that instance, right? So this is my global calling policy. This is my automate demo policy. And so it's going to generate that Excel spreadsheet. And with Excel, at least you can generate some pivot table and do some reporting. Under the cover, however, the tool to do this uses another open source tool that I manage called DSC Parser. So let's say you do an export, you pass it in the parser, it will generate an array of PowerShell object, and then you can start doing queries. You can say, tell me how many teams in my environment have more than 10 channels. Right? Because it's all converted to objects. So you can start querying, getting information that you want with that. So you can convert the PS1 file into an official object that you can manipulate with whatever script you want. So again, very powerful. So I've got my Excel report generated here. Moving on to the fifth pillar, which is the synchronize. All right, I need to figure out how to flip this back to present a view. Sorry about this. Seems like my PowerPoint's losing its mind right now. Let's try this. All right, get there. So the fifth pillar is the ability to do synchronization. Synchronization. Imagine that you have two tenants. Let's say that tenant A is your prod tenant and you're trying to do a demo to customer and you just want to replicate all the configuration from your production tenant into a new demo tenant. Well, with the export feature, you can export the configuration from tenant A. You can use the automation piece to go and replicate it over tenant B. Right, so real scenario is when you're actually trying to create demos from your environment. One scenario where I have a customer, they're managing 100-something tenants. Now, don't ask me why, but they have 100 tenants. And they want to make sure that all the security and compliance layer is kept consistent across them all. So on a regular basis, what they'll do is they'll actually extract the configuration from security and compliance from one of their tenants. what they call their golden image, and they'll replicate it across, or they'll do an assessment, which we're going to talk about, to assess what tenants are not compliant with this export. Another real scenario we had was a department in the government of Canada. Recently, they activated their Teams deployment on a US instance back in 2018 for proof of concept. They were aware of it at the time, that it was going to be in US. It was for a small proof of concept. And then fast forward to March 2020, COVID-19 hits us. They want to be up and running so that their users can start working from home. And somebody there said, hey, by the way, we have Teams activated. Let's just activate it to 10,000 users, right? We already have a Teams instance. So they activated that. Users started creating Teams channels all over the place. And then somebody raised a flag saying, oh, by the way, it's in the US data center and we're a department of the government of Canada. That's going to be a problem. So we came in, we used the tool, we extracted all their Teams, all their channels, all their users, private channels. And the conversation were a different beast. We had a separate script that extracted that as text file. Once we had the extract done, the product team helped us shut down the US instance of their Teams and spin off a brand new one in a Canadian data center. We took the export and we just replicated it right on top of it. So that was it. So within 3 days, I think their entire thing was exported and recreated in the Canadian data center. Another good example would be when you just want to leverage the monitoring feature of Microsoft 365DSC. You already have a tenant. You're not looking at changing your process and starting to write configuration as code. What you want, though, is to be notified of any configuration drift that happens in your tenant starting today. So it's this idea of you take the export feature, you ask the question to your tenant, hey, tenant, tell me how you're currently configured. You get that configuration, and the moment you have it, you push it right back at the tenant and you say, by the way, your current configuration has become your desired configuration, and from now on, any configuration drift you report. You're not writing any code, right? You're just basically adding the DSC layer on top of your tenant to be able to get that notification when configuration drift happens. So hopefully that answers the question for some of the use cases. If not, just feel free to ask anything else. So that's for the synchronization. What we're going to do now is, remember I was telling you I have this target tenant here. So in the test, the target tenant, if I refresh this, I don't have any meeting or custom meetings policies coming up anytime now. So you can see I don't have any NIC demo policy 1 and NIC demo policy 2, which I was showing you previously from my export. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that export that I did from my source tenant, and I'm going to run it against my target tenant. Just by passing it the credentials of my target tenant, it's going to go and take that export from one tenant and apply it on the other one. So let's just run this here. It should take maybe a minute or two, but basically what it's doing right now is replicating all the Teams calling policies and Teams meeting policies from one tenant over another one, because that's what I extracted. Right? So it should take a few seconds, and then I'll come back and I'll have it applied on the other one. Another reason, I mean, the most common scenario, to be honest, for the synchronization is really when you're trying to do quick temporary tenant that represent your production, right? So for example, you're trying to troubleshoot something for a customer, or you're just working on a temporary demo for a certain customer. You want to make sure you grab all the configuration from productions and you just reply them on that temporary tenant. That is the most common scenario that we have. But I mean, it opens the door to many other scenarios that we did not foresee in the beginning, like that thing about migrating from a US data instance over to a Canadian one. That was not something we intended to use the tool for, but definitely works. So let's just go back to that demo. It's creating it right now. By the end of it, I mean, we're going to see, it's no surprises there, but it's going to go and create those meeting policies. So it should just be a few seconds now. And there we go. All right, so let's refresh that. And there you go. So my two demo policies have been recreated. So the two tenants are now in sync. And if you hear some background noise, that is because the kids are back home for lunch and they're shouting at one another. So the funs of having kids at home. So I guess if you do security consulting and you want to configure a customer to be compliant with a desired state, blah, blah, blah. Yes, absolutely. And for that question that we have in the chat, I think it's going to be answered by the next or the last pillar, which is the assessment piece. So let's jump into it. Hopefully I'll click the right one this time. All right. So the last pillar is the assessment piece. We let you do really two types of assessment. The first one is to assess against what we call a blueprint. A blueprint is a good known configuration that was vetted. Think of it as best practices. Okay? So you take the tool, you point it at a blueprint, it will analyze your tenant. It won't deploy anything. It just does an analysis of how is your tenant configuration matching with the best practices, and it will generate a discrepancy report. Real example, we're currently working with the education space to come up with a, for the folks in the US, the school for kids is actually referred to as K-12, not something I'm familiar with. I'm from Canada, we have a different system, but K-12 schools, from what I understand, is all the schools across the country that for young kids, right? And what they're looking to do is to help the schools get started with teams as quickly as possible. So they came up with a blueprint for K-12 schools. For schools that don't have any Teams instance, what they do is they take the blueprint and they actually apply it. For teams that have, for schools that have Teams, but that, let's say, did not really follow the instruction manual, where they have a Teams instance that was deployed a bit all over the place. They want to know, all right, so what did we do wrong? Like, where are we not compliant with the best practices? So they actually just do the assessment against that, and they get that discrepancy report, and they can go and manually fix where they're not matching the best practices. So if you go to the official website, again, so Microsoft365DSC.com, we have a section called Blueprint. Now it's extremely quiet in there. What we do is publicly right now, we only have two blueprints available, the SharePoint baseline and the Teams baseline. If you click on this, you can see what that baseline defines. You can download it if you want. But one thing we let you do as well is just by running this one command, it's going to go and download automatically that blueprint. It's going to prompt you for credentials of the tenant you wish to assess against that blueprint, and it will run the analysis. We are working right now on creating a new repo so this is a project that will probably happening sometime in June, where we're going to be open sourcing some industry specific blueprints. Right. So my take on this is that nobody knows the industry better than the industry themselves. So we want to make sure that we have folks contributing to those blueprints so that we can actually, Microsoft's going to be helping out. It's not something that Microsoft will say, hey, here's how you need to go and do your Teams deployment for the health industry, right? That's not it. But we want to make sure we actually have a community effort in building those some best practices that we've seen. So what I'm going to do now is I have my K-12 blueprint looks something like this here, right? So a bunch of team stuff in there. And I'm going to go and assess my source tenant against that blueprint. So what I'll do is I'll do an assert M365DSC template, and I'll pass in the path of my K-12 M365 file. By the way, the extension is .m365 for those configurations that have been vetted. Don't let it fool you. It's really a PS1 file that's been renamed M365. It's just to differentiate blueprints from actual configurations. So if I run this here, first thing it's going to do is ask me for my source tenant credentials, which I'm going to go and get. So let me just quickly go there. All right. Did I lose? So I got kicked out of my demo tenant. Off we go. And then in this case, it's going to be assessing my tenant against a local file. But as I mentioned, if you pass in the command that's on the actual website, it will go and download that blueprint locally. So I'm going to get my credentials. Off we go. All right, so source credentials. I'll run this here, and I'll let it run. Okay, it's going to take about a minute or two just to do the full assessment. So we'll let it run. I just want to go back to the slides, and then we'll come back to what the results are here. But again, it's this idea of being able to quickly go and do an assessment and generate a Delta report out of your blueprint compared to your current configuration. The next type of assessment that will let you do is to assess different tenants. So you have tenant A, you have tenant B. You want to know what's different from a configuration perspective between the two tenants. So what you do is you do an export of both, and then you just do a comparison using the tool, and it will generate a delta report, discrepancy report. This here is extremely useful if you're doing things like mergers and acquisition. Right? So you have two tenants, you want to try to merge them down to one. You want to figure out what's configured how in what tenant. You can use this and get the discrepancy report. You take that report back to the table, and then commonly with the IT team, you agree, all right, so who's right for the setting? Are we going to take the setting from tenant A or tenant B for calling policy ABC, for example? And then you pick and choose. The third type of assessment we'll let you do is assess between 2 points in time. So we have customers that have taken the discipline of doing monthly exports. So let's say you do an export at the beginning of April 2020, you do another one on May 1st, and you want to know, all right, what changed? Hopefully you know what changed, but we all know it's not the reality. So you want to be able to generate, again, the discrepancy report between 2 point in times. Right? So you'll get that discrepancy report as well. So let's go back to the demo real quick. So that assessment should come back with a bunch of red text to let us know where we're not compliant, because I know for a fact my source tenant is not compliant with the K-12 blueprint. Should be done any seconds now. There you go. So it's telling me, all right, so your tenant settings are not compliant, your teams calling policies are not compliant, so on. So this is very verbose. So this is why the Delta report is really useful. The other thing we have as well is every machine that runs Microsoft 365 DSC will have a Microsoft 365 DSC journal log created. And in there, you can actually get very in-depth information about what the drift is. In this case here, it's telling me that my global Teams messaging policy is not compliant with the K-12 blueprint because my current policies allow for user chat, whereas the K-12 template disallows it. User delete message is set to true, where we don't recommend you enabling it. Right, so you have really good insights as to what the issues were. Now, the other thing we want to do is we want to provide you that discrepancy report that's really high candy. So what we'll do is I've actually done a full export of my source tenant. So everything, Exchange, all the policies in Exchange, all my security and compliance stuff, all my SharePoint Online, all my team stuff. I've done the same thing with my target tenant. Now I want to figure out what's different between the two. So to do that, I'm going to call into the command that's available out of the box with the tool called new M365DSC Delta report. And that will actually scan the source, scan the target, and figure out what the discrepancies are. So let me just quickly run this. So what we're seeing here is actually the DSC parser doing its job. So it's converting that to PowerShell objects, and then it's doing the comparison, and boom, it launched my report in my other screen. And there you go. So what this is telling me right now is that in my target tenant, so on my source tenant, I have a sensitivity label in security and compliance called license plate info that doesn't exist in the target. This is no surprise because this is actually something we deployed with the first demo. If you remember correctly, we created that sensitivity label on the source tenant. We didn't do it in the target tenant. So that's why there's a discrepancy here. So it's telling you what exists in the source that doesn't exist in the tenant, vice versa. And then it will tell you what exists in both, but that's configured differently. So if we go to the different configuration, in here, what is spotted is that from a OneDrive perspective, the notification in OneDrive for business enable is set to true in my source tenant, but it's actually set to false in my destination tenant. So there's a drift right there. So it's up to you to figure out how you want to address it, because it's a drift between two tenants, but you have a full report. You can give that back to the user and say, look, here's where the discrepancies are. You need to make a decision as to what the good configuration should be for that resulting tenant if you're doing like a merger, for example. And that concludes it, right on time, better than Vlad before. So I'm right at 11:50. If you have any questions, let's quickly go back. I don't see any questions being asked right now. If you do have any, my Twitter handle is at the bottom of every slide that you've seen. Everything that I presented today, everything is on my GitHub. So if you go to github.com/Nick Charlebois, challenge is always to be able to spell my last name, and you go to conferences. In there, everything I present at any conference is always stored in there. You can go to the Microsoft Virtual Marathon. You'll get my French deck, my English deck, and all the demos are in there as well. So again, feel free to reach out on Twitter if you have any questions. Please use the tool if you're interested in contributing. Ping me. I'll be more than happy to take some time to set up a call to get you started and helping with the team. I hope you appreciated the session, and I wish you a good rest of the conference.